everyone, wherever you are. Thank you very much for joining us today for the 7th annual meeting of the Innovation for Cool Earth Forum, hosted by Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry and New Energy and Industrial Technology Development Organization. First of all, let me announce that we have just recovered from an unexpected internal server error caused by Cisco WebEx system. Remote speakers may be disconnected if we face the connecting issue again during the session. We appreciate your kind understanding. And during this session, we'll be accepting questions from all of you. To ask a question, simply go to the question submission area toward the bottom of your page, or access the question submission page from the program menu. We look forward to receiving your questions. And we would now like to start plenary session 3. First, I would like to introduce the moderator of this session, Dr. Yamaji Kenji. Dr. Yamaji is Senior Vice President and Director General of Research Institute of Innovative Technology for the Earth and Professor Emeritus of the University of Tokyo. The speakers for this session are Ms. Fiona Reynolds, Chief Executive Officer of Principles for Responsible Investment, Professor Manfred Fischedick, Scientific Managing Director of Wuppertal Institute for Climate, Environment and Energy, Mr. Tom Delay CBE, Chief Executive of the Carbon Trust, and Dr. Yoshino Akira, Director of Global Zero Emission Research Center, National Institute of Advanced Industrial Science and Technology. And now I would like to ask Dr. Yamaji to moderate this session. Dr. Yamaji, if you please.
Okay, thank you very much for the kind introduction. And could you show my slide? Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, let me start the plenary session 3. I'm Kenji Yamaji, and I will moderate this session. And the theme of this session is Road to Beyond Zero. But I will briefly explain about Beyond Zero. Beyond zero might sound strange because beyond zero has an implication of over or above zero. But on the contrary, since our effort to achieve to stabilize climate change forwarding the greenhouse gas emission reductions, so beyond zero in ICEF2020 means to achieve the negative or minus greenhouse gas emissions. And in order to achieve net zero and more ambitiously beyond zero emission, in other words, reducing the carbon dioxide accumulated in the atmosphere by 2050. The technological innovation as well as social innovation will be necessary in the field of electricity, hydrogen, and the use of fossil fuel with CCUS. Additionally, there is a need for social acceptance as well as a new social structure that promotes innovations, and the effort must be dedicated to solving social issues. So this session will discuss the current state and the challenges of technologies and social innovations, their integration, public involvement, and the finance approach in achieving beyond zero. Okay, as stated, it is a timeline, but the time is limited. While I was told that 75 minutes are allocated to this session, as shown here, but closing session will start 17:30 of Japan Standard Time. So we must conclude this session by that time at latest. So after my introductory talk, I will invite short presentations by 4 speakers. And immediately after each presentation, we will have a short question and answer time between the speaker and myself. Then we will have a general discussion session time with all speakers, including responses to the questions from the audience. Then wrap up. And reflecting the general theme of ICEF2020, I encourage speakers to include the 2 points to the discussions, the impacts of COVID-19 and gender equality. Very fortunately, we have successfully invited 4 distinguished speakers for this session. In the order of the first round short presentations, first speaker is Ms. Fiona Reynolds. And the title of her presentation is the role of investors in achieving net zero. And then Dr. Akira Yoshino. As all of you know, Dr. Yoshino was awarded Nobel Prize for Chemistry last year. And the title of his presentation is Introduction of RD20, Research and Development 20 for Clean Energy Technologies. And next is Professor Manfred Fischedick. And his title of talk is Roles and the Interplay of Industry, Academia, Governments, Financial Institutions, and Civil Society in Achieving Ambitious Goals, case studies from Germany. And the last one in the first round short presentation is provided by Mr. Tom Delay, CBE. I don't know his topic of his presentation, but he will explain himself. Okay, then let me start with a short presentation by Ms. Fiona Reynolds. Fiona, please.
Well, thank you, and thank you, everyone. I hope everyone is safe and well wherever you might be. So today, as was said, I'm going to talk briefly about the critical role of investors in achieving net zero. If we can go to the next slide. For those of you who are not familiar with the PRI, I just want to give you a very, very quick introduction. So we represent the responsible investment community with more than 3,000 global signatories to our 6 principles. And those investors collectively represent over 100 trillion US in assets under management. In Japan, they include investors like GPIF. So the PRI was formed in 2006, and it was formed out of the UN system by a small but committed group of 86 asset owners. And it was really about aiming to bring sustainability to capital markets. And some 14 years later, responsible investment is now becoming far more mainstream, and we have over 3,000 signatories, as I said. So our signatories work to incorporate environmental, social, and governance issues into their investment processes. And the issue that is at the top of investors' list, as well as COVID-19, is climate change and the transition to a zero carbon economy. So today I want to discuss the role, as I said, that investors are playing in the transition, because they do have a very important role. We could go to the next slide, please. Investors are actually really critical to the transition. In fact, I believe that without the finance sector, we will not solve climate change, and the transition simply won't happen with the urgency that's required, because we need finance, we need funding. Investors importantly have leverage, and they need to utilise it to protect their portfolios and to ensure that they are investing for the long term. Within our signatory base, investors are really working across 4 areas to utilise the levers that they have to influence change. And these are through 1, corporate engagement, 2, through investment, so the investments that they do and don't make, investor disclosure, and policy and advocacy with government. And I just want to touch briefly on each of these areas. So if we go to the next slide, I'm going to start with corporate engagement or stewardship. So one of the key levers that investors have is in their role as the major shareholders in companies. And a great example of some of the work that we're doing is through an initiative that the PRI is part of, which is called Climate Action 100 Plus. So we formed Climate Action 100 Plus just under 3 years ago with other investor groups. And it's the largest ever investor to corporate engagement that's ever taken place. It has 500 investors involved and they represent over 47 trillion US in assets under management. And the initiative targets the largest 100 emitting companies in the world, plus another 61 companies in the hard-to-abate sectors. And in this engagement, we've got 3 major asks of companies. The first is that they set a net zero target for 2050 with measurable targets and milestones, which we then benchmark the companies against. We also talk to them about their governance. So we want to understand what is happening at the board level, what actions are being taken, what's the thinking of the board, so that we know that the appropriate things are happening. The other area is around disclosure. So we ask for disclosure from all of the corporations in line with the Task Force on Climate-related Financial Disclosures, so that investors have the right information they need to really understand what actions companies are taking. And this engagement is having really great success and cut through. If I mention just a few things, recently BP, who is on one of the largest emitting companies in the world list, updated its net zero ambition. And it's one of the most advanced and ambitious transition plans from an oil and gas company to date. And yes, it's still far from perfect, but it sets out a comprehensive medium-term plan to 2030. And this has been a direct result of our engagement as investors. We're not just engaging in developing countries, this is global. We're also engaging in the developing world, not just the developed world. So if I use as another example, in the developing world, Reliance Industries in India recently announced that it will become net zero by 2035. Although there's still a lot of detail, again, it's one of the first formal net zero commitments from a major Asian company targeted by Climate Action 100 Plus. So more energy intensive companies are making commitments to net zero as a direct result of the investor engagement. And the trend is spreading, particularly across Europe, but it's not limited to Europe. And we're very active in Climate Action 100 Plus in Japan. If I go to the next slide, I want to just talk quickly about investments. On the investment side, investors are not just asking companies to set net zero targets, they're also committing them to them themselves. Last September, together with our sister organisation UNEP-FI at the UN Secretary General's Climate Summit, we launched the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance, or AOA. It now has 30 asset owners who are committed to net zero across their entire portfolio by 2050, and it includes some of the largest investors in the world, such as Allianz and AXA. And this is really groundbreaking work. It is not done before. Currently, the Asset Owner Alliance members are road testing the decarbonisation of their individual investment portfolios for a midterm target for 2025. The target setting framework and the AOA decarbonisation range, which is an absolute emissions reduction in percentage of the investment portfolio, will be out for consultation very shortly. It'll be out this month, and individual asset owner targets will be published in the first quarter of 2021. We also have a financing the transition track, which kicked off in July. We're just finalising the strategy paper, but the aim is to identify the investments that we need that we all really need to make to invest in climate solutions, and then start the discussions with DFIs and with asset managers about how we get those investments going. If we could move to the next slide, looking at climate reporting and disclosure, at the PRI, for our part, we're looking to increase investor accountability on what it means to be a signatory and to take action on environmental issues. And so this includes a more streamlined but a more stretching reporting requirements which come in from July next year. So everyone who's a signatory to the PRI must report on an annual basis against a whole lot of indicators. So we have included the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures into our reporting framework, and we're moving to make all of that reporting mandatory for all of our signatories. If we go to the next slide, I think the final lever that investors have is really around policy and advocacy. So investors are engaging with governments across the globe, as despite all the work that I've outlined from the private sector, it's still pretty difficult to say that you could get to net zero as an investor across your portfolio without changes in government policy settings. A major piece of work that the PRI has been undertaking is called the Inevitable Policy Response. And it shows that the longer the delay in taking policy action, the more forceful and disruptive those policy changes will need to be. And this will affect everyone, but it will particularly impact investment markets. So through our IPR work, we're encouraging investors to act and to not just wait for governments, to act without governments, but also we're encouraging governments. So we see that there's really 8 policy levers that governments can use. One is to set a coal phase-out date, which some governments, like the UK government, have already done, to ban the internal combustion engine and set a date for that, as many countries have now done, set a meaningful price on carbon, encourage investment in CCS, set targets for zero carbon power, put in place energy efficiency measures, put in place nature-based solutions that investors can also invest in, and make changes in agricultural practices. In addition, PRI's report on a sustainable and inclusive recovery outlines 7 key steps that investors can take with their policymakers to encourage engagement. But we also need governments to act. Some are. In the UK, where I live, net zero by 2050 is the law of the land. We have a coal phase-out date. We have a date for the internal combustion engine to be phased out, but we need more. In thinking about COVID-19, just as I wrap up, investors have been very clear that in the recovery to COVID-19, that we need to make sure that we build back better. That needs to include putting in place targets for climate. So with all of the stimulus packages that are out there, with all the government money that is out there, we need to make sure that that money also takes forward climate ambitions. We need to make sure that money given to corporates and to different sectors is not condition-free, that it helps to drive the environmental issues that we need to make sure we meet the ambitions of the Paris Agreement. So while there's a lot of work being done by the investment community, the corporate sector, and by governments, there is far more that needs to be done, and we need to move further, faster. So thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Fiona, for an impressive presentations. Indeed, finance for innovations matters, and finance is very important to realize carbon neutrality and beyond zero. And principles for responsible investment will provide stimulus to business sectors to realize sustainable society. But on the other hand, realizing beyond zero or carbon neutrality is very big economic challenge. It could be very costly. And finance is a very important part of economic activities, and economic activities needs profits, and investment needs returns. So my question is, how do you think to make finance for beyond zero profitable?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. But I do think that when I'm talking about the investors that we work with, I'm talking about very long-term investors. So all the major pension funds, for example, in the world who are investing our pension fund money, and you're doing that across a 50, 60, 70-year time horizon. So if you think about climate change, there is no way to invest in a way, if you're investing over that long time period, that you're not going to be impacted by the changes in the climate that's already happening. So you have to be part of driving the transition so that you do not lose money, that you don't end up with a whole lot of stranded assets, because the policy changes mean that things that you're invested in, whether that's a coal plant or something of the like, don't become stranded assets, because government policy means things have changed and you can't actually extract those assets. So you have to stay in front of where this debate is going and help drive it, and that's what investors are doing. Investors also can make money out of the transition. If you are investing in the energy of the future, if you're investing in the technology of the future, then that will be good for your portfolio of the long term. Of course, it's always hard to tell who's going to be the winners and the losers when it comes to climate change. But one thing that we do know is any investor who's sitting there thinking that the world is not changing and invests in a way of the past will be the people who are left behind, because those companies are the ones that will be left behind. And that's what our focus is on. Our focus is, how do we get to net zero? How do we make money? How do we protect our portfolio? And we believe that all of those things can be done.
Oh, thank you very much. And then we'd like to move to the next presentation. Next is Yoshino-sensei. Yoshino-sensei, please.
This is an introduction of ICEF2020, Research and Development 20 for Clean Energy Technologies. ICEF2020 is the international conference hosted by Aisd. Aisd, National Institute of Advanced Industrial Science and Technology, is one of the largest public research institutes in Japan, established in 2001 by the integration of 50 national institutes under METI, Ministry of Economy, Trade, and Industry. ICEF2020 has been studied as one of the Japanese initiatives to accelerate the innovations in the context of climate change, which was first announced at the Davos meeting in January 2019. The G20 members, which account for the major portion of the global CO2 emissions, are expected to play a leadership role by leading innovation and development of clean energy technologies. Accordingly, the ICEF2020 brings together the heads of the leading R&D institutes in the G20 members. The ICEF2020 provides an opportunity to exchange R&D activities related to the current issues on the clean energy technologies and to explore the potential of international collaboration, including the joint projects among the leading R&D institutes. The first ICEF2020 was held in October last year in Tokyo with the participation of 23 institutions. The participants shared the same awareness that mutual collaboration among ICEF20 members and international standardization is crucial, and collaboration with ICEF is beneficial. These are summarized as the ICEF20 Chair Summary. This year, 2020, Aisd hosts the second ICEF20. The conference is composed of technical sessions and leaders' sessions, both held as hybrid virtual physical sessions. The technical sessions were held last week to address global issues on 4 topics, as listed here. The leaders' session, on the other hand, will be held tomorrow, October 9th, to address at a high level the global collaboration on research, standardization, and human resource development. Conclusions from the leaders' session will be compiled in a leaders' statement. Dr. Yoshino Akira, Director of the Global Zero Emission Research Center of AIST, takes the stages on these sessions. We think it is a good opportunity to introduce Dr. Yoshino's talk briefly in the technical session on September 30th on the role of battery storage in the next generation energy system. He received the 2019 Nobel Prize in Chemistry for his research on the development of lithium-ion batteries. Lithium-ion batteries, or LIB, has been attracting many attentions in the society, mainly for two reasons. First, LIB made the mobile IT society possible. And second, LIB is expected to contribute to the sustainable society. Concerning the sustainable society, he emphasized the importance of battery technology in every area of technology. It is also suggested that the linkage of LIB technology with new technologies has a great potential to achieve a better society where the environment, economy, and convenience are balanced in harmony. This is a summary of Dr. Yoshino's talk. We believe the importance of innovation in energy and the environment to solve climate change issues. We hope that the ICEF and ICEF2020 can collaborate to realize the ultimate goal of a decarbonized society. Last but not least, we would like to share you a brief introduction video of the Global Zero Emission Research Center of Aisd. Thank you for your attention.
産業技術総合研究所ゼロエミッション国際共同研究センター長の吉野です。このセンターは政府の革新的環境イノベーション戦略という理念を実現するために設立された新しい研究開発組織です。世界のカーボンニュートラル、さらにはビヨンドゼロに向けた技術革新を目指しています。地球環境問題は相当な難題ですが、その解決は不可能ではありません。ただし、一つの技術で解決できるものではありません。いくつかの技術を融合させていくことが大事だと思っております。地球環境問題の解決に必要なことは、環境性、経済性、 利便性の3つの要素が揃うことが必須の要件になります。この3つの要素は一見相反するものと思われますが、不可能を可能にする、これがイノベーションであり、このセンターの使命だと考えております。国際協調も含めたアプローチでサステイナブル社会を実現していきましょう。
Thank you very much, Yoshino Sensei, for a nice video message introducing RD20 and various activities of Global Zero Emission Research Center. But allow me to speak in Japanese for the conversation with Yoshino Sensei, because it's convenient for us and also convenient for the Japanese audience.
So you do a lot of research. You have photovoltaic, you have battery. They're all important. The theme of this session is beyond zero, going beyond zero. So with PV, you can perhaps achieve zero, but you can't go negative. And we're trying to go beyond zero into negative territory. So people talk about afforestation, or using biomass, but the CO2 coming out of CO2 coming out of biomass being captured with CCS. So at your GZR, what are the specific initiatives you have for the beyond zero, and what's the scenario that you have? So we need to curb CO2 emissions. That, of course, is very important, but as you pointed out, we have to have negative emission technologies. That's going to be even more important. So where do we find the answers, the solutions? This might sound philosophical, but I think the clue is found in this trend of carbon gas concentration since the Earth was born. So it was several tens of percent when Earth was born. That has gone down to 400 ppm. Two factors are in play. So carbon gas, they're acidic. So there is a neutralization, and that has led to CO2 concentration coming down. So calcium carbonate has been formed, so it's been fixed in that form. But that kind of neutralization reaction has ended, at least on the surface of the Earth, with the substances on the surface of the Earth. The neutralization reaction has already ended, but there are much alkali substances underground, so maybe using that to capture CO2 may be one way. And then there is photosynthesis. Oxygen concentration is about 20%. So that means CO2 has been absorbed. And we have a lot of research about biomass. So maybe one major innovation can be added there. If that happens, then we could have a new technology which is different from the capabilities that we had with biomass. And I think algae has a lot of potential because their yield of photosynthesis is quite high, and they are able to absorb CO2 very efficiently. And we can have genetic modification. Those kinds of new technologies can be used. And so we could perhaps create algae that can absorb more CO2 than the varieties that we currently have. So negative emission technologies, we have to work on them in some form or another. Dr. Yoshino, thank you very much for those comments.
Negative
So negative emission technologies sounds like something very special, very peculiar, but there are quite a large number of options, including a carbonate, I guess. So we should have all those options in a portfolio. I think that is quite important.
Move to next. The next is Professor Manfred Fischedick. Professor Fischedick, please.
So good morning, everybody. First of all, thank you very much for the invitation. It's without any doubt a great honor for me to contribute to the conference today. So I was asked by the organizers to talk about roles and interplay for industry, academia, governments, financial institutions, and civil society in achieving ambitious goals from a specific German perspective. Let me start my presentation today with remembering us that achieving ambitious mitigation goals, particularly achieving greenhouse gas neutrality, is related to various challenges and comes out as a very complex transformation process. Of course, we have to take into consideration the technological challenge. We have to talk about an infrastructure challenge. We have to steer capital in the right direction. We have to keep in mind the stakeholder challenge. The policy challenge is very important when dealing with ambitious greenhouse gas mitigation strategies. We have to look for a consistent, for an integrated regional, national, and international policy regime that helps to implement climate protection measures. Social challenge, of course, is very important when it comes to social acceptance. And last but not least, of course, innovation challenge is very important. We have to link technological innovations with smart infrastructures as well as with social innovations. So we have to look for system innovations. That's the goal. So how to trigger technological and social innovations is, of course, a key question when dealing with ambitious greenhouse gas mitigation strategies. So for the presentation today, I selected 4 case studies from Germany, examples about how to shape, how to contribute to the complex transformation pathway and how to trigger technological and social innovations. So my first example is a multi-criteria assessment of innovative energy transformation technologies, which was conducted as a participatory process and which was used for preparation of the German energy research program just 2 years ago. So what we did in this process, we systematically assessed 6 technology sectors with more than 27 technology fields. For the assessment, we used a broad set of criteria. In total, we used 12 different criteria. So we started with assessing the funding relevance as a general criteria for innovative technologies. The second step, we assessed the potential contribution to climate policy and energy-related goals. The third step, we try to figure out what is the contribution of the different innovation processes and technologies for positioning the German industry in the German research arena in the international competitive arena. And last but not least, we assessed technology openness, system aspect, and of course, social acceptance. That was done in a very participatory process. So we involved the stakeholder in that process from industry, from academia, even partly from NGO and from civil society in different formats. We did face-to-face interviews, we did a lot of workshops, online surveys, so that at the end we came out with a robust assessment of innovative and promising technologies that now become part of the energy research program. The second case that I would like to highlight is the development process of the climate protection plan for North Rhine-Westphalia. Just to remember you, what is North Rhine-Westphalia? North Rhine-Westphalia is a federal state in Germany. It's the biggest state we have in Germany with around 18 million inhabitants. It's the most important economic and industrial region in Germany, so it's home of many energy and resource intensive industries and home of coal and lignite mines. So it's a very important state for the question of successfully implementation of the energy transformation process in Germany. So what was done in this climate protection plan process? What have been the objectives of that process? Of course, to specify the central strategies and the needs to achieve the Energiewende. Secondly, to bundle strategies and measures in a consistent scenarios and pathways. And of course, again, the identification of innovation needs from a technological, institutional, and social dimension was one of the objectives of the climate protection plan process for the state of North Rhine-Westphalia. But for us today, particular interest is the stakeholder involvement process. So in the development process of the strategy, more than 400 stakeholders from various institutions have been involved, energy utilities, energy intensive industries, commerce chambers, consumer associations, environmental driven NGOs, and many more actors have been involved from the very beginning in the development process of the climate protection plan. It was complemented by an interministerial working group that helped to, again, to create support for the development process. At the end, it was a quite successful process. It created a lot of trust and it created a lot of support. So the expectation is that the chance to successfully implement such kind of climate protection plan is much higher in comparison to the conventional process. The process created a couple of follow-up activities. So one of the follow-up activities, and maybe even the most important one, is the so-called Infor Climate initiative. So Infor Climate, NRW, is a new and unique collaboration platform between industry, science, and the state government of North Rhine-Westphalia. Its aim is to develop strategies to achieve the Paris climate targets while maintaining or even improving the high competitiveness of energy-intensive industries in North Rhine-Westphalia. So there are a lot of partners involved from the scientific arena, from academia, but there are even more partners involved from the industry sector. So at the moment, more than 32 industry companies are part of that process. So the cooperation between academia and the industry is organized in so-called innovation teams. Here people from the different perspectives work closely together in a very intensive cooperation process. So what they are doing in those innovation teams can be summarized in 4 steps. Innovation teams try to give impulses for development of new technologies. Innovation teams try to get a common understanding about future pathways. The innovation teams try to discuss the needs for restructuring the economy when implementing specific strategies. And last but not least, innovation teams come out with proposals about how to create an appropriate policy framework. You can find a lot of more information about the initiative in the internet. You can even find a short video highlighting the process and highlighting the steps forward. Let me close my presentation just with a link to international cooperation, which also helps and is absolutely necessary to trigger innovations and to contribute to achieving ambitious greenhouse gas mitigation goals. So 4 years ago, together with Japanese scientific partners, we created the so-called German-Japanese Energy Transition Council. And in that council, we do nothing else than experience exchange with regard to successful implementation steps, with regard to promising innovative technologies, and with regard to promising policy instruments. It's a huge discussion process between scientific institutions from both countries, and we also have formats where we implement and invite industry companies. So a lot of examples from the German perspectives, so let me just close my very short presentation with thanking you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Manfred, for providing us very impressive German case studies for driving innovations. I understand the importance of stakeholder dialogue, ranging from industry association to scientific community and NGOs. I think social acceptance for innovation is very important, and not only social acceptance, but for a more proactive approach. I mean, social innovations along with technological innovations are indispensable for realizing greenhouse gas neutrality and beyond zero by innovating social infrastructures or by changing people's lifestyle. So my question is, I'd like to ask you, what type of social innovations are important and how we can promote such social innovations?
Yes, thank you very much for your question. Let me first of all say that, of course, beyond zero requires to combine all available technologies, but we have to keep in mind the technologies have to be embedded in the broader context. If you mentioned in your question, to be successful, we need an appropriate policy framework, we need appropriate cultural framework, we need appropriate social framework and the right institutions. And that includes, of course, the necessity to go for stakeholder involvement that guarantees not only social acceptance, but guarantees to bring in the bigger fantasy. Let's frame it in that way. The bigger fantasy of all the stakeholders to identify robust technologies and to identify even technology gaps. In addition to that, it's very important that this kind of stakeholder involvement creates an investment and implementation atmosphere. So coming back to your question, already this kind of stakeholder involvement is a kind of social innovation that is needed to build the basis not only for the identification of new technologies and technology needs, but also to create a solid basis for involvement, for investment of stakeholders. So that's what I wanted to highlight.
Okay, thank you very much. And then the last speaker of the first round short presentation is Tom Delay CBE. And we don't know the topic or title of your presentations, but please begin.
Okay, firstly, I'd very much like to thank ICEF for this opportunity to share some insights from the work of the Carbon Trust. We are a global organization with offices in Beijing, Singapore, Africa, Europe, Mexico, and the US. And essentially, we help corporates develop net zero pathways, look at the realities of that as a long-term challenge in getting to net zero and beyond zero. But we also work on technology development, and we're well known for over a decade's worth of work in offshore wind as a particular technology area. I'd like to make my remarks briefly in three areas. Firstly, just to scope out why it is so challenging to achieve net zero for many aspects of the economy. Secondly, I'd like to consider where we have got to today, really looking at the period between the Paris Agreement, going through the emergence of Greta and an intergenerational change, and now COVID. And lastly, I'd like to just highlight some of the challenges that we all face and why maybe at the moment we should not declare victory. So at the very beginning of our story, natural resources, including fossil fuels, materials, water and land, have been used to create the economy of today because they were abundant and they were cheap. As a result, pretty much every aspect of the economy, from buildings and transport to food and clothing, as we see it today, is wasteful. But worse still, the production and burning of fossil fuels in creating that economy also has created greenhouse gases, the sources of climate change. The good news is that there is huge technical potential to increase resource productivity, so the infrastructure, products and services of tomorrow can be radically different, and they must be. I have to say the industries that will create those services for the future will be very different, and I think that is a great opportunity to include and introduce more diversity into the factors that will create the businesses that will be those. In addition, the challenge of reducing fossil fuel use is obviously essential to achieving net zero and beyond. And that's putting a particular focus on the energy sector and how it is going to be at the heart of a transition. To put a very quick sense of scale, the net zero challenge is huge, and in particular, it is difficult because the pace of change is beyond that which normal markets would enable. We're used to seeing markets come through, develop and bring on board technologies, deploy them. The societal response to that takes place at a certain pace. The risk associated with that introduction typically mandates the investment that is being made. What we need, though, in terms of the transition to net zero is to go beyond the normal pace of change, take more risk, make investment ahead of, in many cases, proven concepts. That is enormously challenging. And to give a sense of scale again, the economy in 2050 globally will be about twice the economy that we have today. And the growth of the economy is going to be very much predicated around new infrastructure and particularly growth in the Southeast Asian region. Now, where we stand today is very much determined by a building up of momentum that we saw in the corporate sector coming out of the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement was very fundamental, not only because it brought governments together, but it also allowed the corporate sector to become part of this transition to net zero and beyond. And the corporate sector has embraced that. Pretty much every sector of the economy is now developing net zero pathways. And the financial institutions, as Fiona was talking about earlier, are also very much part of that alignment process. So aligned interests become a force for good. We then saw, about 18 months, 2 years ago, the emergence of the Greta situation. Greta Thunberg, more than anybody else, engaged a whole new generation in the challenge of moving to net zero and brought about an intergenerational dialogue that is shaping much of corporate action around the world today. Nobody in the corporate world is ignoring the influence of Greta in drawing and speaking truth to power so powerfully with leaders around the world in saying, you have got to do more. And that's helped build this momentum that we're seeing today. And now, of course, we see COVID, and the impact of COVID is enormous. It is potentially very disruptive, but it's also a great builder of momentum going forward. We know that economic stimulus post-COVID can build on this momentum, create jobs, capitalizing on a public realization that we really can change more quickly and more fundamentally than was widely accepted beforehand. I think that's going to make an enormous difference. And societally, people have recognized within the period of the pandemic that there are actually some soft benefits that they are enjoying. People are talking about bluer skies, cleaner air, and I think are more in touch with what the world means to them and how important it is to transform to a net zero future. So I think there's a great deal of momentum. It's bringing about great societal shift, but it very much depends on getting an alignment between policy, finance, and the capacity of big businesses to actually make things happen. And there are some challenges to this very briefly. Firstly, lock-in. I think there is a real risk that behaviors and consumption and infrastructure all get locked in and held in place by vested short-term interests. And they actually provide a narrative that supports an alternative which says we will not reach net zero. And that's dangerous in itself. Secondly, deep decarbonisation needs technology breakthroughs and often in novel solutions where there isn't a natural owner. As you start looking at radical solutions to technologies and power production, etc., you often reach out and say, but there is no industry to bring this forward. That is in itself a challenge. And lastly, I think accelerated change in key sectors needs very effective long-term decision-making by businesses, governments, and asset managers. And that's hard. It's very hard to achieve. The level of cohesion that other speakers have spoken to is what we must all aspire to, but we're a long way from achieving that in practice on the ground today. So I think at that point, if I may, I'll finish my comments, and hopefully you're able to hear that.
Thank you very much. We can hear you quite well. And thank you for providing us an information about the activities of the Carbon Trust and your wide-ranging view on the net zero and beyond zero. My question is, you mentioned that repeatedly the importance of the target of net zero or beyond zero. But still, on the other hand, you said that it's very difficult to realize using the ordinary market mechanisms. And yes, you add several items after that, mentioning that. Could you repeat or elaborate more about what kind of a market or what kind of institutional arrangement to promote and to finally realize net zero or beyond zero?
Yeah. Well, let me give a very clear and I think very real example right now. Most businesses operate within a time frame that is defined by their business plan. And however long-term the assets of the business are, the business plan is typically 3 to 5 years. It's very hard to see long-term investment, particularly into an uncertain future. And yet at the same time, these organizations are making net zero claims and developing pathways that rely on greenhouse gas removals towards the latter end of that transition. And greenhouse gas removals, of course, scaled up are the way of achieving beyond zero. Now, there is no market for greenhouse gas removals. At the moment, there are markets for carbon offsets that provide an element of carbon neutrality to businesses today. But very few of those offsets are actually greenhouse gas removals. And of course, we can look at nature-based solutions, we can look at geological solutions, and we can look at direct air capture. Now, all of these are ways of achieving real greenhouse gas removals, but there is no market pull, so they are very much dependent for their funding in the development phase on public funding and, to some degree, philanthropic in some parts of the world. What we are looking at, actually, is developing essentially a market mechanism whereby greenhouse gas removals that may really only achieve scale in 10, 20, maybe even 30 years' time are actually pulled through on the basis of the claims and commitments that are being made by companies who will need those greenhouse gas removals. Now, it may be in the form of an advanced procurement exercise. It may be direct funding by the people who need the solution to achieve some of the development today. I'll highlight Microsoft, whose commitments to net zero include a commitment of over $1 billion to developing direct air capture solutions. Amazon, in its climate pledge, has also put a commitment of $2 billion into the development of greenhouse gas removals. So I think it's a combination of public funding and government funding and pull coming from the people who ultimately will need greenhouse gas removals to achieve net zero and go beyond zero.
Oh, thank you very much. So let me start the time for the general discussion, including responses to questions from the audience. But before that, we are hearing 4 presentations and some question and answer between the speaker and me. So, but how do I say, other speakers may have some questions to the other speakers. If that is, you have some questions to other speakers, I would welcome that. Is there anyone? Just raise hands while you are indicating for your intention to make questions. No questions? Okay, that's good because the time is limited. And, okay, so there are several discussion points remains. One I like to ask you is because in the beginning, introducing the session, this session, I said I encourage you to incorporate the two items. One is the impact of COVID-19, and the other is gender equality. So, but okay, some impact of COVID-19 is already mentioned, but there are few discussions about the gender equality. How do you think about the, say, relationship between climate change response and gender equality? So in this case, I'm sorry because there are only lady speakers. So I ask Fiona to speak first, and then followed by other gentlemen. So Fiona, please.
Well, obviously I think that climate change is going to adversely impact women. If I think about women in developing countries in particular, they've got a lot of responsibility for working out in the fields. And we know that climate change is going to impact how we produce food and what food is produced. They've also obviously got a lot of responsibility for families and for the home. And we also know that we're seeing that there will be impact because of extreme weather effects, etc., that make this women vulnerable as well. So I think that there are a number of issues that it will particularly affect women. We see that women are also, often responsible and working in jobs that are those that are lower paid, and and that these are all areas that will be affected by climate change. So there's no way for women to avoid climate change. And I think that when it comes to gender diversity, that women will be impacted in so many ways, and this needs to be considered.
Well, thank you very much. I agree with you that ladies are more sensitive to the risk associated with climate change. That is very big, important point. So I ask ladies to lead the as a response to the climate change. So
yeah, well, I'm not suggesting that men aren't concerned about climate change, but I do think that women having children, being primarily responsible for caring, obviously are concerned about what climate change will mean for future generations, what it means for their children, what it means for their grandchildren, and the world that their children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren will live in. And you therefore see that women are quite active about climate change in protests, in trying to get governments to do more, and in the way that they vote. So very much thinking about what governments are doing and what governments are saying about their actions. We need to see more of that, of course. We need to see more action from all citizens around the world demanding climate action and climate justice. But I do think that women are playing a big role in this area.
Thank you very much. There are several hands raised. So Manfred first, and then Tom.
Let me just add one thought. I think Fiona is totally right that women are mainly affected by climate change, and they might be even more concerned about the impacts of climate change. The thought I would like to add is that, from my experience, women in many countries are the most important decision makers. they really need what kind of technologies are needed. So they have to be involved in the technology development process. They have to be involved in answering the question, what are really appropriate technologies? What kind of technologies can really serve and cover the service needs? So they have to be a main part, even for the technology development process, in addition to what was mentioned by Fiona.
Thank you very much. Then Tom, and after Tom, the Yoshino Sensei.
Okay. I agree with everything that's been said about gender so far. I'd just like to build on it in one area. The energy sector traditionally has been dominated by men. It's been a very male sector, the way in which it's been organized and run. And we're seeing an enormous shift in that. At the moment, we're recruiting literally 20, 30 people every 3 months, typically young, brilliant graduates who want to commit to a career in sustainability and help organizations, cities, regions achieve net zero. And a majority of those people are now women. We are reflecting the demographic within senior and higher education establishments around the world. And I have to say, the demand is just there from women who want to be part of the solution, as well as being more adversely affected by climate change than men. And I think that's very exciting. Many of them come from science and engineering backgrounds that you wouldn't necessarily have associated with having a great number of women. And yet those women who are from those backgrounds are choosing sustainability as a place to build their careers. And I think that's incredibly positive, and it's something we should all welcome.
Thank you very much. So, Yoshino Sensei, please.
Hi.
So, this issue of COVID and the global environment issue and the gender issue. So let me comment talking about all three together. So this COVID issue, well, we have this COVID pandemic. And as you know, UN is proposing SDGs, 17 goals. And where to place COVID within those 17? Actually, it's goal number 3, health to all. So there is that item in the SDGs that can deal with the COVID. So this is a lesson for humankind. And so if we ignore even one of the 17 SDGs, we're going to get into big trouble. I think that's the lesson that we learned. So from an environmental perspective, so I think about a third of the 17 are related to the global environment. Therefore, the lesson we learned from COVID, we have to apply to the global environmental issue as well. That is that if we ignore even one of those 17 goals, it's going to create huge problems. And I think the same can be said about gender. Gender is also one of the 17 goals. So gender, global environmental issue, COVID issue. In each of these, if you ignore even one aspect, we're going to be hit badly. That's the lesson that we learned from COVID. That's how I feel.
I agree with your comment about SDGs, because we should achieve well-balanced achievement of all 17 SDGs. Okay. Fiona, please.
Important in sorry, I didn't turn myself off mute. I just wanted to follow on from the discussion on the SDGs, because I think they're very important to the recovery from COVID-19. In fact, I think the SDGs have never been so important. I really like to think of the Sustainable Development Goals as the world's business plan. And if we don't need governments creating a whole lot of new plans to recover from COVID-19, we need to use the plan that we have, which is the SDGs, the targets, and we need to fund it. And in that way, we will recover from COVID-19 in a way that is far more sustainable, far more equitable, far more green, and we will set the world up in a far better direction. So I do think the recovery needs to be underpinned by the Sustainable Development Goals.
Thank you very much for the very active discussions. And okay, we have to receive some questions from the audience. And okay, of course, one is included, already discussed about gender equalities. And there are several others, but I pick up one question. That is, what are the plans and the roadmap for petroleum sector to achieve zero emissions? And what is the time frame for petroleum sector to realize net zero? It's a bit technological question, I think, but I think, Tom, you have been associated with petroleum business, right?
Yeah, I spent 16 years working for Shell around the world, mainly in Africa and Europe. Yeah, I think the oil and gas companies face fundamental challenges in transitioning to a low-carbon future. And for a number of years, there's been reluctance within those organizations to acknowledge that transition will really impact on them. I think they, to some degree, say, look, we've enabled industrial revolution, we've pulled people out of poverty globally, economic progress relies on our energy. Nothing will change that. I think now we realize things will change that fundamentally. And I think the leading oil and gas companies have now positioned themselves in a transition mode. And as Fiona was saying, BP, being a very good example, did something extraordinary just a couple of weeks ago. They talked in the same narrative and literally in the same piece about the way in which they will curtail their oil and gas work. They will essentially retire the business core of the organization whilst building an alternative business, which is largely going to be around power. What's even more impressive is that the way in which they translate that is through a description to shareholders as to how they will maintain dividend policy through that period. And then to some degree, that gives the timescale. It's happening from now. They're building up their power portfolio as quickly as they can. Their target for 2030, interestingly, is about the same as Enel, an Italian power company with very huge renewable portfolios in Latin America, 46 gigawatts just over, have already got. And so there is this transition, I would argue, over a 10-year period where the business models are fundamentally going to change. Now, there are other people in the oil and gas sector who are not in that same position and don't have the same will or maybe capability and capacity to do that because of their investor base and indeed their ownership structures. But the leaders, I think we're going to see, are going to make enormous progress even in a 10-year period. And I think within 20 years, they will be unrecognizable as the oil and gas companies of today.
Thank you very much. So the Fiona raised the hand. So Fiona, please.
I just wanted to add to what Tom has said. So all of the oil and gas majors are part of the engagement that I talked about with Climate Action 100 Plus that the investment community is doing with the largest 100 emitters. And I think that we are seeing significant changes happening. So we've certainly been engaging as Climate Action 100 Plus with BP, with Total, with Shell. All of those organisations are making 2050 targets, but they're also setting shorter term targets, which we can then benchmark them against and will benchmark them against, and keep our dialogue going. It's one thing to set a very a target out to 2050. We could all do that, but we have to have shorter term targets as well. There are also many of them starting to include scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions. They're committing across their operations. But coming back to the point Tom's making, as well. I just want to take that one step further. I think that there is a big transatlantic divide. So what we're seeing is a lot of action within particularly within, European oil and gas majors, but we're not necessarily seeing that happen in the US. So we're not seeing the same action from Exxon and Chevron, for example. And, we do need to bridge that divide. And this is where it takes political will and the will of the country to be setting the direction, and the will of governments to be able to set the direction for the public sector. And I still think in some of those countries, there is a very big lobby movement that tries to stop having action on climate change, which is, as in part of the investment community, we've also been trying to work on to say, not use our shareholder money to fund organisations that will lobby against climate action, because that is not in our long-term interest. And we need to do more in that way, all of us, to stop the anti-climate lobbyists from winning the day.
Oh, thank you very much. I'm watching the clock, and now already we passed 75 minutes, but still have some time for the beginning, by the beginning of the closing sessions. And Manfred, raising your hand, but please make your present speech as short as possible. I'm sorry for that.
Yeah, sure. I will be very brief, and I just wanted to add that the discussion about the change of the business model of the petroleum sector is not really new. So we had the discussion already 20 years ago. Think about the Beyond Oil frame from BP and others. But now I think we're in a totally different situation. We have now clear decisions by the management of major companies. We already heard about it. We have a critical mass of initiatives and clear investments. And from a technology perspective, we have now the clear decision of many petroleum companies to go into the direction of investments in electricity generation, in PV, in wind, onshore and offshore farms. And we have the situation that many of them started thinking of switching from fossil-based fuels into a new area of green fuels, be it hydrogen or synthetic fuels. So that was my additional remark, that we are now really in a completely different situation than 10 or 20 years ago, when starting for the first time about thinking about a new business model in the petroleum sector. Now I think we are in a real change, in a real transformation process of particularly this sector.
Oh, thank you very much. As I told you, we are closing to the time limit, and so I like to gradually move to the wrap up. But before talking my brief summary of this session, I'd like to ask some volunteers of you just like to say some last one word. Please raise your hand. No intention to suppress your talks. It's okay. Okay, so thank you very much. Okay, so I like to say some keywords for Beyond Zero as a wrap-up of this session. Firstly, Beyond Zero is absolutely necessary to achieve greenhouse gas neutrality, to cancel out the remaining emissions. And second, robust portfolio of innovative technologies, including negative emission technologies, is also necessary to achieve greenhouse gas neutrality, and the long pathway with many uncertainties. And thirdly, not only technological innovations, social innovations play an important role for realizing Beyond Zero, such as realizing low energy demand scenario as a baseline by promoting sharing and circular economy. And finance for innovation matters. I have already commented to the Fiona's presentation. And Beyond Zero must be included in green recovery from COVID-19. Okay, so that is my wrap up. So thank you very much, and thank you for your valuable contributions. And plenary session 3 on road to Beyond Zero is closed. Thank you very much.